So welcome everybody. I'm Aaron Benjamin, UK and Europe Coalition Lead for the Direct Air Capture Coalition. This event will be streamed on the Carbon Removals at COP platform. The event for today is the gift from the Rift, Kenya's CDR opportunity. So joining me today, I have James Mwangi, Executive Director of Dalberg Group and founder of Climate Action Platform Africa, CAPE, and Martin Freimüller, CEO and founder of Octavia Carbon, Kenya and Africa's first direct air capture company. Looking forward to hearing both of your insights. Thank you both for joining me.
Thank you.
So let's start off with a fairly high-level question. What is the state of play in Kenya with regards to CDR? Who's doing it and at what scale? So James, let's start with you.
So firstly, I think there's a state of play today, which is early and a lot of interest, and where I think it's going. I think there's a growing recognition of CDR as a potential opportunity. There is some entrepreneurial activity led by folks like Martin and the team at Octavia. And I think importantly, there's growing alignment among folks on the scaling path around, hey, this could be a really interesting space for us. So if you talk about particularly CDR and you're thinking about long-term storage, you've got a lot of the geothermal players, for example, starting to ask the question, could this be one of the things that helps our economics work better or that helps us scale faster in terms of the rollout of Kenya's geothermal potential? And then at the policy level, you are starting to hear more of a sense of, well, we do need to attract these kinds of green energy hungry industries to Kenya as an attractive hub. You know, yesterday or the day before yesterday, Kenya signed an agreement to do one of the first kind of green ammonia plants in the world, specifically focused on local fertilizer manufacture. And it's kind of in that same area. We have lots of electricity, potentially, and what are the use cases for it that are in line with the green transition?
Mm-hmm. Mm. So it sounds like, Kenya's really advancing and building the foundations for a CDR industry. Martin, as one of the innovators in that space, I wonder if you could talk about, how you and Octavia plan to plug into these resources or plug into these foundations.
Absolutely. I think if I can just quickly add to the point here is that I think it also really has to be stressed that there's amazing grassroots activity going on in Kenya, very strong, building on a really long legacy of environmental leadership in Kenya, both with being the headquarters of UNEP, also like Wangari Maathai, our leading environmentalist who won a Peace Nobel Prize in 2006. So really there's a lot happening, and we are in many ways just trying to tap the talent and tap the enthusiasm that there is around environmental leadership in East Africa. And ultimately, I think East Africa has amazing resources, as we've heard, both on the energy side and the geological side, which I'm sure we'll dive more into. But ultimately, it's around unleashing Kenya's talent. There is a lot of young engineers who have experienced climate change firsthand, who know what it means for rivers to dry up, who knows what it means to, for the relatives to wait for rain and that not coming. Kenya is experiencing the worst droughts in generations. And they have an incentive to fix it, ultimately. I think that's really what I've personally found is that the inspirational thing about young Kenyans here is that they don't fix this as an abstract problem. They fix it because they feel it.
Yeah. Very interesting. And I wonder, this is a nice segue in to talk about Octavia. I know Octavia's team is full of young Kenyan graduates, which is just amazing. So why don't you tell us a little bit about Octavia and the progress and its mission?
Yeah, absolutely. So Octavia was started when, I moved to Kenya partly with the intention of starting the company there, just because I realized that the ingredients you need, the energy, the geology, and the talent are really perfectly lined up. And funny enough, independently, two young engineers at the University of Nairobi looked into this problem. They're called Duncan and Mike, and they've both been with me since June, basically, working on this problem. We've joined forces through the Open Air Collective that I give a shout out today. And we found that we really have the same interests in making this happen. And we've since been on a very quick tech development journey of developing a prototype in Kenya, 1 ton of CO2 a year prototype. So that, by the way, it's just for a sense of scale, that's about 100 trees worth of carbon capture. We are now looking to build more and larger machines, first targeting sort of like the utilization sector for that CO2, but ultimately really looking to make Kenya the place of choice and the hub that it deserves to be for a direct air carbon capture industry.
Right.
And the talent that we have has been a key ingredient in how fast we've been able to move. I sort of I often get excited about this with people I know in the global DAX space, basically, and I say, if I face a problem, and this has happened 3-4 times, basically, and I'm like, oh, our electrical control system is really difficult. Okay, so how do we fix that there? My engineers call the smartest electrical engineer they know, and they are there the next morning and getting started. That's the talent pipeline you have in Kenya. These people are highly motivated and they want to dig their teeth in, basically. And we've had an absolutely amazing experience working with these young engineers to fix the engineering problems we faced and also ultimately to build this space in Kenya.
Yeah. It's really interesting you touched on the idea of open source problem solving pretty much. The CDR space is on such a massive mission and its goals are so huge that the only way we really can achieve it is by working together, and open source is a wonderful way to do it. James, Martin talks about a lot about the talent coming out of Kenya, and one of the missions of CAPE is to really boost Africa's endogenous talents and assets. So how does CAPE plug into this ecosystem, this Kenyan ecosystem, or Africa's ecosystem? Yeah. What is its mission and what is it trying to do?
I think critically what we see as the CAPE role in all of this is basically unlocking the broader ecosystem, exactly as you've said, because for CDR to work at scale, you need a couple of things, right? You need enabling policies. You need a broader awareness. You need people, that talent pool that's out there waiting for purpose, waiting for mission, waiting for opportunities. I mean, they know what they want to work on, but what are their pathways? They need to understand that this is an industry of the future and what potential scale it could be. Kenya is disproportionately rich, it turns out, in geochemist talent, for example, right? Because we've got a big geothermal industry. A lot of those folks have grown up thinking, well, my job is going to be rolling out electricity and energy access for the country. But as you can see the light go on, I've been spending time talking to teams at various, for example, geothermal energy companies, and you can see the light go on as they say, wait, here are multiple other applications for the skills that we have that in a sense take some of the agency into our own hands. Because, for example, you're sitting there's nothing more frustrating if you're an electrical engineer, a geochemist, a geologist, than sitting there on top of 10 gigawatts of untapped, high-quality geothermal energy and saying, the only thing stopping us from unlocking this is that there isn't the bankable demand. The world doesn't believe that we can build the industries to use this, and so there's no financing to actually tap it. We know exactly how to build, we know exactly where to drill, we know exactly what to do, but for some reason the machine isn't working. And what industries like direct air capture do is they begin to create a sense of agency. We can build our own demand. We can tap into the industries of the future and be involved in forming them from day one. And that's exciting for them. It's also interesting, that's exciting for the younger generation. It was really interesting engaging with one of the older generation. So the chief engineer at Kenya's largest geothermal complex spent most of his early career training in Iceland. And he saw the early beginnings of some of the carbon mineralization work there. He was engaged in it. And he couldn't believe that people were now starting to talk about doing it here. He's like, I used to drive around and say, well, if only Kenya was a kind of place where people, because I can see the basalts that they've been looking at. I'll even drive you to where they are, right? I know this could work. I understand the challenges of it. And seeing him almost be rejuvenated, he's a year away from retirement, the classic, cop movie cliche. I'm like, one last day on the job. And he's like, wait, this is starting to happen now. Maybe I can stick around and help. So there's something there about energizing the decision makers. But I think, and Martin is so spot on, the biggest resource that Kenya has is going to be that young talent. And it's not just Kenya, it's across Africa because, there's just more young people there and intelligence is evenly distributed. So there's going to be a lot of untapped talent that's hungry for opportunity. And this feels like the kind of industry that they can really sink their teeth into.
You mentioned climate finance and the need to unlock finance for this DAC industry to really take off. in Kenya. I'd love to get your opinions and thoughts on where's this finance coming from? Is it coming from, multinational organizations? Is it coming from the UN? Is it coming, where's this money coming from? Or where would you like to see this money coming from? Perhaps is a better way of asking.
I think the private sector. And I think we still have a journey to walk because, at the end of the day, for early stage venture risk, public money, whether it's from the UN or from national, is a terrible source for that, except, where you have enough public money to just go for, full grants to start a sector. You're not going to get that in Kenya unless other countries want to invest. So the only way to do it is to actually get private sector investors to understand what the commercial opportunity is and be clear about how it stacks up versus other locations in the world. Now, in addition, developmental money can help on the margins, but the scale of resources we're going to need, for example, to take a resource like the Barrier Geothermal Complex in Lake Turkana, which is a gigawatt of just untapped energy right next to high quality solar, high quality wind. We're talking hundreds of millions initially, billions eventually, and you don't get that going without private sector money. However, there is a role, for example, for advanced market commitments. Like, if we can get the folks who are buying the, permanent removals to say, actually, we think this is a place that could be a key part of the scaling journey, and we will buy tonnage from this location. We will definitely buy tonnage from this location. That begins to change things. If we can get the venture investors who are looking at this starting to think, well, where does this industry get to scale early, and starting to actually back companies that either have a location there, have teams there, then that begins to change. But right now what we're finding is everyone gets the logic and everyone's like, well, you first. Which is why when someone does go first, and Octavia is going first, we really have to lean in and say, this needs to succeed. For Kenya, yes, but frankly for the planet as well, because getting this to scale is key, and I'm not sure where else you get it to scale quickly enough.
Yeah. And just to add a nuance on that, just specifically towards risk capital, which as a startup I've sort of experienced firsthand of what that looks like in Kenya. I think it's not necessarily even that there isn't people there, but I think they aren't really pushing far enough yet, really. Ultimately, you have to get climate finance, and that means risk capital, venture capital, into every major university campus in the country, and you have to push out into sort of second-tier cities. Don't just like camp in Nairobi, but actually find the innovators where they are, and you'll be very surprised about the talent, about the solution that you'll actually find, about people's ability to adapt and solve their own climate-induced problems, basically. But for that to happen, you really have to push the climate finance much further up the pipeline, basically, because that's the problem we have at the moment. There is climate finance, yes, but to access that, and I can tell you stories about that, that is a bureaucratic nightmare, especially for a young company. And much of the climate finance that there is, and I think this is a slightly separate angle to this problem as well, is I think sort of more philanthropically inclined, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. And I think there is just really a place for grants and so on to help people adapt to their problem and so on. But I think a point that I really share with Cap A is we really have to think about this in commercial terms as well. If you want the solutions of tomorrow that are going to apply to, by 2050, we're talking something like 3 billion Africans, as well as, much of the rest of the global south, chances are those are going to come exactly from a place like Kenya. Kenya has a long history in sort of starting innovations like, for example, mobile money, that then spread across the world and they get adopted almost globally. But ironically, one of the places where mobile money hasn't really had a foothold yet is the global north. So it really just goes to show that like the kind of innovation that is sparked in Kenya can really solve problems for billions of people. But we need the right capital, and especially risk capital, in the right places.
Yeah, so we've spoken a little bit about finance and the obstacles or the opportunities that it can provide. Across Kenya, we're seeing a really blossoming ecosystem, whether that be Octavia on the innovation side, Sela mineral storage on the storage side and carbon mineralization, CAPE and Nairobi Climate Network as a kind of ecosystem actor. Where would you say some of the holes are that need filling? This ecosystem needs to be holistic, and it needs to have actors and forerunners, across all sectors. So where would you say are the gaps that need filling in order to make this ecosystem holistic? So James, I'll start with you.
I think I'm just going to underline part of what Martin just touched on. I think we need a deeper pool of better informed early stage venture investors, as well as more agile, risk-loving, catalytic, philanthropic or developmental capital. So what we're seeing right now is and there's a substantial pool of actors who are looking to deploy money towards climate action in Africa who are based in Nairobi. It's kind of the biggest hub of them. But I think a lot of that is focused on kind of the stereotypical things people think about when they think about climate in Africa. It's a lot of adaptation and resilience work, which is crucial, right? I do not want to gainsay it. And there's, almost the minute you say you want to work in climate and climate finance, it's immediately, well, how do I help deal with the crisis of the moment? What you're not seeing is a building up of the kind of capacity to forward project and say, not just what might the future look like, but how is this place a part of the global solution? It's much more, that challenge that CAPE has been wrestling with of shifting the narrative from Africa as a pure climate victim to being uniquely positioned to play a transformative role for the global climate equation. That's something that resonates with people, but it takes a long time to turn the big tankers of institutional culture. The thing that should happen quicker, though, is getting more venture oriented actors interested. Frankly, that's where I'm heading. I agree with you that there's just this need and this potential, and I'm saying, well, if no one else is going to do it, I'll go out there and start making some early venture stage investments on the ground in the country with this climate thesis. But I think those are the two things that need to happen.
And I think just, again, to highlight a point there, again, I think people think of climate in Africa, and I've experienced this myself, and so like, oh yeah, are you doing agriculture? No. Are you doing trees? No. Okay, so you don't qualify, basically. Yeah. And I think we should really be aware that climate tech of all stripes, and not even just CDR, really needs global south supply chains to tumble down the cost curve at a pace that we absolutely require. We've seen that abundantly with solar, we've seen it with battery and so on. And the place where you'll get that cost-effective supply chain, especially 10, 20 years from now, is one of the only remaining places with a demographic dividend left, which is much of Africa, actually. And East Africa specifically is extremely well positioned to capitalize on that. We'll have a 100% renewable grid by 2030. Even right now, if I plug in my machine in Nairobi, it's virtually 100% renewable. I mean, overall the grid is 92% renewable, but none of that electricity actually gets to Nairobi. So the opportunity is there right now. We can develop technologically sophisticated products for the new carbon economy, for the new climate economy in Kenya. Kenya is an ideal place to do just that, basically. And from there, it can spread outwards across East Africa and eventually, hopefully, all of Africa. But I think we also have to bring a certain mindset that, it's not just about, agriculture and trees. It's really about like building the machines of the future. And ultimately, I think all my engineers and myself are just like going to work every day energized by just that problem, by basically like showing that we can do this in Kenya. They ultimately really want to build Kenya's future economy that way because they just see it. They absolutely see that the ingredients are there, and we just need partners internationally to walk that with and help us realize those ingredients, basically.
Yeah, so interesting to hear, the hunger and drive of East Africa to play a part and play a major role, it seems, projected in this transition. I wonder a short point around policy, because we haven't really touched on that yet. We've got the Kenyan delegation here of outspoken advocates of CDR. So what needs to happen on the policy side to really engage and scale this industry?
So interestingly, I think right now the biggest policy challenges are what need to happen outside of Africa on this industry. I think that there's a growing recognition, a growing acceptance of what the scientists have been saying in the fine print and now increasingly loudly about the role that CDR is going to have to play if we are to avoid the very worst kind of climate scenarios. And a lot of countries are saying, well, now we need to invest in these industries. You're seeing a lot of activity in the United States, in Europe, elsewhere. But it seems all entirely premised on, well, let's try and build these industries. Let's deploy our capital, our ingenuity, and our resources to do this in the locations that happen to be within our sovereign borders. And all the economics in the early stages of these industries seem to be optimized for that. And that seems to be a missed opportunity. Because if you take the same view, in a sense, the logic that got the global fossil fuel industry to be so big and so effective at putting carbon dioxide in the air was one that says you go where the resources are, and then you deploy the capital, the technologies, the resources, etc., to take the resource from there and take it elsewhere. I think we need to run that in reverse, and we need to take a truly global view and ask, well, how far would the dollar of incentives towards CDR go? How much further would it go if it incentivized investors, engineers, other actors, buyers from these countries to look globally for the point of best supply of CDR, than if you say, well, it has to be within the borders of the European Union or the United States, etc. And that I think is the critical shift. There's a number of sub-shifts within that. But when I talk to folks like Sela, for example, who are looking at the first place to deploy their particular mineralization technology, what I hear them say is, look, in terms of just the ability to get the actual thing going, there's a lot of things that are already attractive about the policy regime in Kenya, but Kenya doesn't have lots of capital to throw at this, and there's not the level of domestic demand for this kind of removals that would be necessary to get this going. And so when we go to our investors, they say, all I'm seeing is you're adding additional country risk into our equation. Why don't you just find a location in country A or B? And in a sense, shifting that is good for everyone, right? Because where the DAC machine sits shouldn't matter to humanity. It's how much yield am I getting from it, and how durably is it being stored. And at that level, frankly, you should be asking, and it's not just about Kenya, we should be agnostic and saying, where do we want to incentivize this work to be done? The same way that we would say, where are the reserves of any other natural resource, and where do we want to deploy?
And if we can just add a tiny bit to that, to just answer your question about what the specific asks to Kenyan policymakers would be, I concur absolutely with James that there is a lot of policy action that needs to happen in the global north to really not just shut themselves off to the carbon credits that we can produce very cost effectively in Africa, and especially in Kenya. I think on the local front, I think there would be definitely a lift up if we had sort of like concentrated and industrial parks, or call them whatever you will, where we have very good access to round-the-clock renewable energy, where we have ideally access to storage sites for CO2, ideally access to geothermal heat as well. All that's been in conversation for a long time. If we can accelerate that and really get it on the ground right now, you will see that an investment boom of even international companies keen to actually build this industry in Kenya will come very soon, and we'll be the first ones to set up.
An exciting prospect, no doubt.
Yeah.
So one of my final questions, I guess, is around the co-benefits of CDR in Kenya specifically. We know that Kenya's grid runs on 92% renewables, a fantastic feat in itself. But DAC being quite an energy-intensive industry, what are some of the co-benefits that might include energy access that we'll see for CDR? Perhaps we can talk about the finance side to local communities, but how are we pitching CDR to communities that will be directly impacted by CDR in Kenya?
So I think this is where one of these puzzles that just engage me is the energy paradox in countries like Kenya. And so just for people listening who may not know this, is Kenya's entire grid is about 3 gigawatts, right? That's not a particularly massive American city in terms of how much energy the entire country has on the grid. There's more than that in individual generators and off-grid generators and solar and so on, but 3 gigawatts. The country's potential there's 10 gigawatts of currently nine of untapped geothermal. So we've used one, there's 10 more. That's base load energy available 24/7. The country has utility grade wind or utility base load quality wind. So Lake Turkana wind, which is the largest wind farm in Africa, 300 megawatts could go to 4 gigawatts. Has a capacity factor for a terrestrial wind project second to only one other project in the world, right? It's up, it's up there at 65%. It's just crazily high quality wind. And the country's on the equator, which means we don't have seasonal variation in our solar. So you put all of that together, and then you ask the question, why does Kenya's energy vision today only have us getting something like 30 gigawatts in the next 20 years? Or it did until very recently. And the reason was there's no demand. And if you don't have demand, there's no way to finance the rollout of this energy. And so what energy-hungry industries do in a weird way, right, particularly energy-hungry industries that want that green energy, is they actually unlock energy access for everyone, right? So to take Martin's idea of a green industrial park, one of the ideas we're pushing is saying, can we get a dedicated development of, say, a gigawatt of energy that goes into these kind of green applications, everything from green hydrogen, green ammonia, et cetera, with the expectation that, say, 20% of that is made available for other applications or sold onto the grid. But by virtue of having that offtake, that energy-hungry industry to begin with, you suddenly take the biggest challenge for a government like Kenya's off the table, because they're saying, we have a buyer. We have a commercially viable business case for this. We're not going to end up in the problem that Kenya currently has, which is we actually ended up buying more renewable energy than we could place. And so energy is one of the big drivers of the cost of energy, is all the renewable energy the consumer isn't using. So that's a roundabout way of saying any energy-hungry, renewable, green energy-hungry use case should be looking at countries like this, because the thing it does is it lowers the price of energy for everyone, for mass industrialization and for job creation.
Mm. And then I think just on the last point around job creation, just to add something really quickly, because it energizes me every time I go to work, and not to underestimate, like the 7 young Kenyans that I work with are extremely energized to come to work every day to fix the problems they see their country having. And in many ways, there is a bunch of SDGs around, innovation, industrialization, decent work, and so on. And I think really having something that Kenya can give to the world, and just to take it back to the title, the gift from the rift, actually, I think the co-benefit of like creating millions potentially of really forward-looking jobs, basically, and really decent paying jobs, industrialized jobs, jobs that give to the world, jobs that can make Kenya a lead exporter of a key commodity the world needs, which is negative carbon emissions. That will be extremely crucial, and we already see it as having a big impact on the engineers we employ, their communities, their environments, the people they talk to. It being an inspiration to many more people to just use their talents towards this challenge, basically. So I think the benefits on the job creation side really are very multiplicative, basically, because we want to create a mindset in young Kenyans that they can fix that massive problem the world has and that they experience in their country, and in the meantime also lift their country out of poverty to upper middle income status, at least.
I really wanted to just pick up one thing, because Martin, you just triggered it for me on the job side. If you think about the challenge of reducing global emissions, a good chunk of it is about how do we decarbonize manufacturing. And a lot of manufacturing today happens in carbon intensive locations, very high emissions grids, lots of coal, lots of gas. Just by unlocking the build out of more green power, you suddenly make it credible to say, build that next auto assembly plant for the world in Kenya versus in a country that has a much more high emitting grid. And that actually has knock-on benefits on the job side. So we're talking about the people working in the climate space, but also for potential young auto workers, potential young light manufacturing workers, garment workers, etc. In each case, you're kind of creating the energy source that allows them to be part of the green transition for the entire planet, essentially lowering the carbon content, the embodied carbon content of the jacket I'm wearing, just by shifting its manufacture from a place with an emitting grid to a place with actually a negative emitting grid. that already is impact above and beyond the carbon that we sequester as we race towards net zero.
Yeah, a great final point to end on there. So I'd like to thank you both for joining me today. This event will be streamed on the Carbon Removals at COP platform, so make sure you check in. We've got a host of events, including the flagship event of the Urban Future Labs tomorrow, so make sure you check in for that. Again, thank you to my guests, James Mwangi and Martin Freimüller, and have a good rest of the COP.
Thanks for the invitation.
Thank you very much, Aaron.